to Alyssa Jean's Star Trek Reviews. My name is Alyssa, and this is my top 10 least favorite episodes of Star Trek, the original series. Now, once upon a time, in a former channel that no longer exists on the internet, I once did a video called the top 10 worst episodes of the original series, so this is a reboot of that. But I have rebranded it as my personal least favorite, just to really emphasize that this is merely my personal opinion, my personal preference. It's not some definitive list. In my previous video, people seemed to think that it was okay to say that their opinion was objectively correct and my opinion was objectively wrong, which is just silly. It's just opinion. It's all for fun. Please feel free to share your opinion, what you didn't like in the original series, in the comments below. But the other thing I need to talk about real quick is that when I changed it to least favorite from worst, I found that the list changed. Because when I was looking at the worst, I'm strictly looking at what's bad, what's poorly written, what's poorly acted, etc. Just overall low quality. Whereas when I started thinking about my least favorite, then I had to consider my emotions. What episodes piss me off? What episodes irritate me? What episodes really make me sick to my stomach? So that means that some episodes that were maybe lower down are a little higher up now. And I have a different number one than I had before because of it. Alright, I want to get into it, but real quick, a pseudo-spoiler warning. I expect that you have seen these episodes before, probably multiple times, so not only am I going to spoil it, but I'm not really going to give plot summaries for most of them. I just assume you know what happened in them. Alright, with all of that out of the way, now we can jump right into my 10 least favorite episodes of the original series. And now, ladies and gentlemen, number 10. At number 10, Charlie X. So this one actually did not make my original top 10 worst list. It was a dishonorable mention. I decided not to do dishonorable mentions this time. Just get right into the top 10. And I'll explain a little bit later why this leaped into the top 10. But I want to start with one thing that I did like about this episode, and that is Yeoman Rand. So Yeoman Rand goes up to Captain Kirk and she's like, hey, listen, you need to do something about that kid of yours, or I will not be held responsible to what happens to him if he touches me again. And I thought that was awesome. However, Captain Kirk doesn't know how to teach a young man, like, not to harass women. I mean, Captain Kirk trying to teach somebody how to respect women would be like Spock trying to teach somebody how to be emotional. Like, it's Captain Kirk. He doesn't know how to do that. So he's just kind of stumbling and bumbling like a nincompoop. And I just hated Captain Kirk in this episode, actually. But not as much as I hated Charlie X. Charlie X is obnoxious. He's one of the most annoying characters I've ever seen on Star Trek. So I found myself irritated this whole episode. So it's the irritation factor that brings us into number 10. At number 9 on my least favorite list is Platos' Stepchildren. This is also a new addition to my list, and it's one that a lot of people pointed out in the comments of my previous video, saying that it's kind of an oversight. Like, where's Platos' Stepchildren? And I'm not usually influenced by the comments, but in this case, I thought, they're right. I really should have had Platos' Stepchildren on, so I'm correcting that mistake. Now, not only is it objectively bad, but it also annoys me. And what really annoys me about this episode is that the writers don't know the difference between telekinesis and mind control. So they say that these beings are telekinetic. So if they're telekinetic, they can make people and objects move the way they want them to, but they cannot make people talk or sing or say things that they want them to say, because that would be mind control. So, for example, they can make Kirk crawl around on the floor with a little person on his back and act like a horse, but they cannot make Kirk go wee, because that would be mind control. They can make Kirk and Spock dance around, as you see in this screenshot, but they cannot make them say Tweedledee and Tweedledum, because that would be mind control. With telekinesis, they would need to be able to control their vocal cords and the movement of their mouth so precisely that they're able to produce the exact sounds that they want them to produce, because all they are doing is making their bodies move, making their mouths move. They cannot make them sing. And that was really annoying too when Spock was singing, because that came across as the writers of Star Trek going, oh, wouldn't it be funny if Spock sang a song? No, it really isn't. It's really annoying. This episode is just so terrible. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about the infamous kiss. Now, this is often credited for the first interracial kiss on television, which it is not. It is probably, though, the first interracial kiss on an American primetime network television popular TV show. So, sure, it was a big deal in the 60s, apparently. I was not around in the 60s, but I understand, people had never seen a black person kiss a white person on TV before, so it was a big deal and all that stuff. I understand that, but now that it's 50-something years later, can we maybe take a step back and realize that this was non-consensual? Like, they were forced to kiss each other, so it's pretty much a form of sexual assault, with, in this case, Uhura and Kirk both being the victims of said assault, and those telekinetic beings in the episode being the perpetrators of the sexual assault. But they were forced to do it. They were forced. It was non-consensual. I don't see it as a big deal. I know I wasn't around in the 60s, but I give no cookies to this episode for this scene, because this episode is still very bad.
Number 8.
At number 8, Spectre of the Gun. And so, in this episode, Captain Kirk and Enterprise are entering into alien territory, and the aliens say, hey, we don't want you here. This is our space. Turn around. And so Captain Kirk responds by saying, screw them, I can do whatever the hell I want. I'm Captain freaking Kirk. So they go into the space anyway, and the aliens capture them and punish them for not listening to them. And how do they punish them? Do they, kill them? Do they just vaporize them instantly? No, they put them through this elaborate, ridiculous scenario where they have to relive the events of Tombstone and the Wyatt Earp stuff, all that stuff. And why do they do this? Because the ratings were pretty bad in Star Trek at the time, and Westerns were popular, and so the creators of the show wanted a Western on Star Trek, and they had not yet thought of the holodeck, which actually they would come up with a few years later in the animated series, surprisingly to me. But anyways, the whole thing is just ridiculous. And also it's bad because Chekhov dies in this episode, and then he just kind of comes back to life. And there's really not any explanation to that whatsoever. And then in the end, the aliens forgive Kirk because I guess he showed compassion to another person's life or something, but that's not why they were mad at him. They were mad at him for invading their space, which he still did. So it made no sense. The whole thing was really just an excuse to get a Western on Star Trek. And by the way, I freaking hate Westerns, which is why this is at number 8 on my least favorite episode list. At number 7, Assignment Earth. This is the episode that starts with Captain Kirk saying, captain's log, stardate, etc., bunch of numbers, blah, blah, blah. The Enterprise has gone back in time for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Actually, the reason they go back in time is so that Gene Roddenberry can present his backdoor pilot for this crappy show that didn't even get picked up in the first place because it's a crappy show. It's so cheesy that he snuck in a plot of his new show into a Star Trek episode, and it just made no sense. And so every time I watch this episode, which hopefully will be never again, I have to sit through an hour of basically Gene Roddenberry's pitch meeting for a shitty show. And in the end, Kirk and Spock are like, our history logs say that these two will go on to have all kinds of wacky adventures together. And I was just waiting for Spock to turn to the screen and say, coming this fall to NBC. They may as well have just done that in the episode, because it was just a giant advertisement for a bad show. And that is why it is number 7 on my least favorite episode list.
Number 6. Number 6.
At number 6, Cat's Paw, the episode that proves pretty definitively that sci-fi and fantasy shows should never attempt a holiday-themed episode. This was Star Trek's Halloween episode. Now, to be fair, they never tried the Christmas episode, which probably would have been disastrous, but the Halloween episode was bad enough. It's just filled with plastic skeletons hanging from the ceiling and witches going around going really for no reason. I mean, there's no plot in this episode at all. It's pretty bad. In fact, when I framed this list as my worst episode list, this was a couple spots up from this. I think it was number 4. It got knocked down a couple spots because although it is bad, it doesn't invoke the emotional reaction in me that some of the other episodes do. But don't get me wrong, I still don't like this episode. Number 5. At number 5, Spock's Brain. Now, this is another one that used to be higher. I think it was number 2 on my TOS worst episode list. And it's number 5 on my least favorite list. I mean, it is objectively bad. I've never heard anyone make the argument that, no, this is a really high quality episode. This is high projection value right here. Nobody says that. And Leonard Nimoy himself said he was embarrassed by this episode. And the reason why it remains on my least favorite list at number 5 is because it is very difficult to sit through. It is another episode I hope never to have to suffer through again. But it dropped a little bit because you'll see the episodes that really piss me off coming up in the top 3. But first, before we get to that, we do have to get to number 4. Error, number 4, just like a mute, number 4. At number 4, The Savage Curtain. So, Abraham Lincoln just kind of floating around in space, hanging out, no big deal. That sort of thing happens all the time in high quality sci-fi. No, not really. This actually represents how Star Trek really jumped the shark at the end of its run, even though it took place before Fonzie jumped the shark. But that's a whole other thing. But it just really went off the rails by the end of its final season, which is the 3rd season. In fact, 3 out of my top 4, not to give you a little bit of a spoiler, but 3 out of my top 4 are from the last 5 or so episodes of the entire series, because it just really went to hell. This really perpetuates the whole presidents as action hero thing that I feel like was really pushed on kids probably in the 60s when this came out, but definitely in the 70s when I was a little kid. I don't really care for it that much, and the whole episode is just hokey AF. Now, bonus points to anyone who remembers that this was actually my number 1 on my top 10 worst episode list. It does fall back to number 4 because of all the things I keep talking about, the emotions and all that stuff. The top 3 episodes just really trigger me in a way that this episode does not. However, this episode still sucks, and it is still my 4th least favorite episode of the original series.
Number 3. Number 3.
And at number 3, Turnabout Intruder. Infamous for being the most sexist episode in all of Star Trek, this episode moves up from number 7 in my previous top 10 worst list, mainly because of the knots in my stomach it creates anytime I watch this sexist garbage. And I'm not just saying this just because I've lived as a trans woman this past year. I felt this way even when I was living as a male. It's just a disgusting episode. And if you don't think it's sexist, then I can name you one person who disagreed with you on that. Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry would later state remorse for the fact that this sexist episode ended up being the series finale. Now, Gene Roddenberry actually didn't really have anything to do with this episode because he was no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the show at this point, which is probably why it just went to complete hell toward the end there. But Star Trek is his baby. His name is on that thing, so he was kind of embarrassed by this, I think. And when I say it's the most sexist episode, though, I don't want to give the impression that there isn't sexism in the rest of this series, because I did a recent rewatch of this series and I made some observations about how women are portrayed, and it's very dated. They are portrayed usually as either 1, bringing Captain Kirk his coffee and food, or 2, just the objects of romance for our male characters. We do get Lieutenant Uhura, but Lieutenant Uhura is criminally underused, and she's, let's be frank, basically a glorified secretary anyways. But this episode is the most sexist. It takes sexism to the next level. It is blatantly sexist. It almost explicitly states by the end of the episode that a woman's place is bringing the captain his coffee. Her place is not in the captain's chair. Women are too emotional and fragile to be the captain of a starship. So disgusting. And let us not also forget William Shatner's ridiculous overacting. This is probably his worst overacting job, maybe just slightly ahead of The Enemy Within. But overall, this episode deserves to be number 3 on my least favorite list. Just the two of us. Number 2, just the two of us. Number 2. And at number 2, my second least favorite episode of the series, The Paradise Syndrome. Now, after talking about the most sexist episode of the series, let's get into the most racist episode of the original series. And yes, racism against Native Americans does count. It counts. And this episode portrays Native American people as ignorant, primitive, and just downright stupid. And they worship this alien race as their gods, mainly because they're so dumb, and they will never be as smart and as sophisticated as us white people. I mean, that message is so loud and clear. It's shocking. It was shocking to watch this episode. Now, to be somewhat fair, I think that this was probably a pretty common portrayal of Native Americans in the 1960 Western genre, but, that doesn't make it okay or anything. And on top of that, there's this so-called romance between Kirk and this Native American woman. In fact, I read on the Wikipedia page that I guess it was Screen Rant that in 2017 listed this as the 7th best romance in Star Trek. I used to have a lot of respect for Screen Rant, but when I read that, my brains fell out of my head. Not only is this not one of the best romances, but it's not even really a romance. There's no love here. It's extremely surface level and very shallow. So Kirk loses his memory and falls in love with this woman simply because she's worshiping him. And she only loves him because she thinks that he's her god and she worships him. And there's absolutely no chemistry between them. And they don't even know each other. There's no love here. This is not a romance. It's awful. But, of course, season 3 is full of terrible romances. Almost every single episode of season 3 has to stick in a really bad romance. And then on top of all that, this episode is so full of plot holes that if it were a boat, it would sink to the bottom of the lake in 5 seconds. And I don't even have time to talk about all the plot holes, but my favorite one is this handy dandy asteroid deflector that this alien race had left for the Native American people on the off chance that an asteroid happens to come by at some point in 1,000 years. So they're able to divert the asteroid that's about to hit this planet. I don't know what they would have done if any one of the other thousands of possible cataclysmic events were to threaten this planet, but hey, they lucked out there. But really, that's the least of this episode's offenses. This is another one that just really makes me sick to my stomach to watch it. It is very difficult to sit through, and my second least favorite episode of the original series. Ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary individuals, and people of all genders, here it is, my number one least favorite episode. And my number one absolute least favorite episode of Star Trek, the original series, is The Way to Eden. This, of course, is the infamous Spaceiffy episode. And as I've said about other episodes earlier on, no one's ever going to say that this is a high-quality, high-production value episode. Nobody says that. Maybe people will say that it's so bad that it's good and it's funny to watch. I mean, I admit that I laugh at this one scene where this red shirt is on the bridge listening to the hippies play their music and kind of bobbling along to it. I mean, that's funny, but for the most part, this episode just really pisses me off. I'm going to make the argument, and hear me out, that this episode, more than Deep Space Nine or Star Trek Discovery or any of that stuff, spits directly in the face of Gene Roddenberry's vision. And Gene Roddenberry, of course, as I mentioned, was no longer involved with the show during this time. So they just completely went against the whole point of the show. Because what Gene Roddenberry envisioned was a world where every country was in peace and we were one united planet, and then we go on to join the United Federation of Planets. In order to get to that point, however, we need to get past our need for war, and particularly the current war that was going on during this era, which was the Vietnam War. And who was the group of people, at least amongst white people, who were most prominently protesting this war and marching for peace? It was the hippies. So what does this episode do? It makes a complete mockery of them. It makes fun of them. It makes them look like idiots. And not that some of them weren't actually like this. Probably they were, but for the most part, it's really making a mockery of not only the hippies, but of the peace movement itself, which the hippies stood for in the 1960s. So what this episode says to me is, hippies, go shut the hell up, get a job, or go join the army and fight for your country in an unjust war like a good American is supposed to do. And that is against everything Gene Roddenberry wanted out of the show. In fact, in the earlier seasons, there are some very powerful pro-peace episodes. which you will hear more about, shameless plug, in my 10 favorite Star Trek The Original Series episodes, which you can now click on in the description below, and you can watch that after you watch this one, because I love some of those pro-peace episodes. It is what Star Trek is really all about. What Star Trek is not about is making fun of and belittling a group of people who are staunchly pro-peace and against war, which is how you get to Roddenberry's vision of a united planet. Anyways, that is it. That is my least favorite episode of the original series. Alrighty then, thank you for joining me for this video. Please check out my original series favorite episodes. If you want something a little more positive, you can find that in the link in the description below. And subscribe. I will see you soon. Bye bye.